you very much, everybody, for coming today. We really appreciate your efforts, not just for today, but during the past 6 Sundays, for coming and following through this course with lots of wonderful speakers, and the majority of which are online now, and we'll be putting these, making improvements to the sound quality, some of them, and so you'll be able to go back and watch them and share them with others. And we're also grateful to Eden Council for supporting this course, as they've done for the last 12 years. And we're also grateful to, today, to Kevork for coming. We're also grateful to Sipan and Zorik for filming these, and also grateful to Carol for helping out, and probably other people like Antranik who helped us with the administration, getting the room ready and so forth. So, as I said, today is the last session, and it's probably the most, one of the most pressing and difficult subjects, which is about the situation in Karabakh. And hopefully we'll have another course, similar course over 6 Sundays next year, probably during its usual time or during the usual period of February and March, because that's when this course usually normally takes place. But due to COVID, we had to delay it. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Kevork, who will introduce himself and also talk to them. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. This is the first lecture I'm giving since the lockdown last year, so actually quite a nice occasion, unfortunately on a very difficult subject. The very insecure situation that we now see in and around Armenia. So I'm Kevork Oskanian. I'm an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham. My specialism is international security, and we'll talk a lot about international security today. And I specialize more specifically in the former Soviet space. That's my regional area of expertise. I've written a book on security in the South Caucasus based on my PhD. I've taught at the University of Westminster and the LSE before the University of Birmingham. And I'm currently working on another project on the crisis of liberalism, Trump, populism and all that. That's my next project. But we'll be talking about Armenia today. And the structure of the lecture will have two aspects, two distinct sections. So first we'll be thinking through what it means to be secure. What does security mean? Because it's a very complicated concept once you get to think about it. So I'll expand on that. And we'll look at specifically 3 aspects of security that are quite relevant to thinking about international security and also Armenia's international security. Namely the fact that security is interactive, that it is multisectoral, that it happens in different sectors of reality, different aspects of reality, and that it happens at different levels. So it happens at the domestic level, it happens at the regional level, and it happens at the global level. So we'll think that through, how that works. And then we'll talk about Armenia. So what happened? Why did things go wrong? Why did Armenia lose the war, the Second Karabakh War? Second, we'll look at the situation now. What is the vantage point as looking at things today between Armenia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Russia, Armenia, Turkey, and so forth. And then I'll expand on what is to be done, and more specifically on the questions facing Armenian society today, that Armenian society will have to respond to. Ultimately, I believe that it's Armenian society in Armenia and in Artsakh that will have to deal with these questions that will most immediately impact on them and their future. So let me, without further ado, let's start with the question: what is security? When I say security, what does that tell you? How do you define security? Safety. Anyone else want to venture a definition? You might say absence of threat. In fact, security is what is known in social science as an essentially contested concept. There are as many definitions of security as there are authors. And I have, this is one page from a book by Barry Buzan, which is a major figure in international security studies. On these 2 pages, you find 13 different definitions from different authors of what security is about. There's a very classical definition on there by a man called Arnold Wolfers, which says that security, in any objective sense, measures the absence of threats to acquired values, and in a subjective sense, the absence of fear that such values will be attacked. I want you to keep that definition in mind. It's an old definition from 1952. And that indicates 2 things. So security has 2 aspects. On the one hand, it's something objective. It's something that you can measure. You can look at a situation and say, okay, now we have security. For instance, you can look at 2 states that are ranged against each other, and you can see that their power is in balance. They can't really attack each other because they see that the other would be able to respond. And you might say, okay, this is a secure situation because they're in balance. On the other hand, security also has a subjective aspect. So that's when you look at actors, they can be states, they can be people, and you ask yourself, do they feel secure? Do they define their own situation as secure? And you find both of these. If you look at these 13 definitions, some will be more objective, some will be more subjective. And that also partly explains why you have so many different definitions of security. The other thing about security is that it has various aspects and various things that you have to look at when you think it through at an international level. So as I said, security is interactive, it's multisectoral, so it happens in various areas of human activity, so the economy, politics, and so forth, and it happens at various levels. Let's go through these one by one. If there are any questions, just don't hesitate to stop me and ask. We have to go through this so we have a very clear, scientific, so to speak, understanding of what security is before we can analyze Armenia's security. Okay, first the idea that security is interactive, and that's something any actor always has to keep in mind. That is that if you take measures that are designed to increase your security, you might have a reaction to the outside world. You don't define your security or secure yourself in a vacuum. You're always surrounded by other actors who might or might not react. And amongst political scientists, that is often called the security dilemma. Okay, the security dilemma is a situation that states sometimes find themselves in. So a state might say, okay, I have a neighbor, and I don't know what that neighbor's intention is. Is that neighbor hostile? Is it friendly? I don't know. And there is no government to go to because states are all equal, right? There is no world government to go to complain. So what does the state do? Okay, decides to arm itself. I'm just going to arm myself just to make sure that, that I'm able to defend myself. What happens? The other state also arms itself. And you get a situation where both states start arming themselves. And you get, state A might think, okay, is confronted with a dilemma because, of course, it can say, oh, I don't arm myself and I trust the other state. But then you always have the fear of being attacked by the other state and finding yourself unarmed. Or it can say, oh, I arm myself. But then, of course, it has to keep in mind that the other state might also arm itself, and then you end up in an insecure situation. That's called a security dilemma. And I'll explain how that relates to Armenia in a second. So the other issue is that security happens over various areas of human activity. So when we say security and we talk about national security, usually what first comes to mind is the military sector. So we think about the army, or we think about the police force, the armed sectors of the state. But when you think security, you have to link that beyond purely the military sector. You have to think about security in the political realm. That's political stability, civic rights, democracy, and all that. You have to think about economy. You can't be secure militarily if you don't have a strong economy. Something called societal security. You have to have your values secure. Your identity has to be secure as well. And of course, environmental security. And very often these various sectors actually contradict each other. So, you might, for instance, say, I live in a very dangerous region. I'm going to put all my efforts in military security. But if you do that, and you end up neglecting your political security and your economic security, you might end up not being able to build up your military. You might end up with emigration. You might end up with corruption. You might end up with authoritarianism. So you see how that works. You have to be very careful about balancing these various sectors of security. And then the third is that security happens over multiple levels. So when you think about security in international politics, you have to think in levels. So you have to look at security at the domestic level. So the societies within a state, under a state. Things like law and order, political stability, rights and freedoms. So that's security at the domestic level. Then you can go up one notch to the regional level, to the state and its neighbors and its immediate neighbors. That's the regional level. So you have to think about that as well. And then at the highest level, you have to think about security at the global level. So that's relations with great powers who are able to be active everywhere in the world, but also the general security situation in global international relations. Okay? So interactive, multisectoral, and multi-level. And this actually explains why, actually crafting sound policy is extremely difficult. And it's especially difficult for small states like Armenia. If you're a large state and you make mistakes balancing all of these things out, usually smaller states suffer. You don't, you get away with it. And God knows, great powers like the United States have made mistakes in the past. They've paid for it in terms of budget deficits and all that, but not in terms of existential issues. But if Armenia makes a mistake balancing all of this out, that's a much more serious issue. That's an existential issue for a small state like Armenia. And I believe that's what's happened. That's the fundamental problem, is that Armenia had balanced these in quite the wrong way over the past 20 years, 20, 30 years. So things were out of kilter, and I'll go through them one by one. So you look at the domestic level, for instance. I'll talk about that. So I'll go in the next two slides through the various levels and discuss them one by one, how I think that things were out of balance in Armenian policy. So let's look at the domestic level, and specifically from the level of from the perspective of these various sectors that had to be balanced out. So in Armenia, the one thing that was the most important was the societal sector. It was about identity, about values, about protecting the Armenian nation, and specifically Artsakh, defining the Armenian nation as including Artsakh and basically doing all of that. Now the problem is, of course, that this was inherited from Soviet times, from before Armenia was a state, and it continued during the post-independence era. And that led, of course, to a very high emphasis on the military. So Armenia was one of the highest spenders in terms of percentage of GDP on military equipment in the world. So it was in the top 3. I think it was 8% of GDP went to military expenditure. And that had its effect on Armenian society as a whole. So the political security for most of the 20 years was defined in terms of a very questionable type of stability. It wasn't based so much on the rule of law and democracy, but more on fluctuating forms of semi-authoritarianism. So forged elections and all that. And that's not really a way of securing your domestic political stability. Democracy was put on a back burner. In the economy, whereas a normally balanced polity would emphasize growth and have an eye on its demographic evolution, What you saw in Armenia, and we have to say it, was corruption. And one of the things that a country like Armenia without natural resources cannot, one of the things that it cannot afford is corruption. We often talk about corruption in Azerbaijan, but Azerbaijan has oil. It can afford its corruption. Armenia can't. And that was one very quite neglected issue within the economic sector over the past 20 years. And of course, emigration. That has to do with all the rest and the demographic collapse of Armenia. So these sectors were out of kilter. And that had very real effects in terms of Armenia's general security. One of the things you need in order to secure yourself as a state is a healthy economy. And what you see, especially from about 2005 onwards, is a complete divergence between the Armenian and Azerbaijani economies. So this yellow line here is GDP the GDP of Azerbaijan. This is Armenia in blue here. So from about 2005, there's a real divergence between the two. So there was a greater and greater imbalance. So I'm explaining why ultimately the conflict occurred. The other thing that was out of kilter, and that explains also what happened in October last year, October-November last year, was the extreme imbalance in military spending, a direct effect of the economic disparities between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So this is military spending in the South Caucasus from 1992 to 2014, and you see this very clear here. Again, from about 2006 onwards, you see this enormous disparity. And this, at the time people were saying, well, Azerbaijan has this huge defense budget, but it also has enormous corruption, which was true. Azerbaijan is much more corrupt than Armenia. And, of course, Armenia had topography in its favor. That's what Armenians always counted on. But at some point, the disparity becomes so big that it is no longer tenable. The balance is off kilter. And just to illustrate, this is a graph of Armenian and Azerbaijani military strength in 2020, September 2020, at the outset of the war. There is already an advantage here between Armenian for Azerbaijan. You can see that very clearly. The red bars are much larger and so forth. But even this hides a very crucial fact, namely that Azerbaijan's military equipment was much more up to date. Everyone has heard of the drones, the Bayraktar drones, and drone warfare. And it's one of the major problems that Armenia faced. Not only was Azerbaijan's budget much higher, it was also much more up to date with its tactics and its strategies. So that's one problem that Armenia was facing. The other problem that explains what happened, these are different ways of explaining, by the way, the war, why it occurred. So one is the idea that there was this huge imbalance between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The other one is that in the South Caucasus, you have a wide variety of regime types of government. You can see this in this list here. Okay, there is a strand in political science that says that's called the democratic peace thesis. Democratic peace. Have you heard of that? The idea that two democracies never go to war with each other. Yeah, it's fairly well known. But yeah, it's a major strand of political science thinking. And if you look at the South Caucasus, you can see why that doesn't work over there. You have at most semi-democratic states. So the most democratic state in the South Caucasus is Georgia. These are figures from last year. So Georgia is the most democratic state. Then you have Armenia, actually not very far behind, 55%, but it's still a semi-democracy, according to Freedom House, which is an organization that compiles data on civic freedoms, the quality of elections, and comes up with this score. So it's out of 100. The higher, the better. So Georgia 60, Armenia 55, Nagorno-Karabakh. They also rate unrecognized states. So Nagorno-Karabakh 35, But then all the rest, they're all full-on authoritarian states. So you have Turkey with 32, Russia with 20, and Azerbaijan with 10, which is a really bad score. And just to give you an idea, the UK has a score of 93, so that's as, almost as democratic as you can get. North Korea has a score of 3. So just, these are the two extremes. The problem with this is that people who believe in the democratic peace thesis, or political scientists who look at things from a liberal perspective, because that's a liberal way of thinking, they will look at this and say, well, yeah, when you have a democracy ranged against an authoritarian state, that's problematic. Democracies trust each other. But a democracy versus authoritarian state, the way you had it between Armenia and Azerbaijan, that's much more problematic for a number of reasons. And added to that, of course, Armenia is considered a semi-democracy. There's a whole argument about the fact that you have to be a full democracy for democratic peace to work. But you get the idea. So there's another way of looking at things and saying, oh, this is why things went out of hand in September last year. And then there's a final way of looking at things, and that actually emerges from an approach to international relations called constructivism. And constructivism deals with identities, with how people and peoples define themselves and define their own territory. And constructivists will look at the South Caucasus, and they will look at how Armenians and Azerbaijanis define themselves. How do they define their own countries? And you can see here very clearly, so we all know that, Armenia, so you have Nagorno-Karabakh, so you have Karabakh, and then you have Western Armenia. So many Armenians define, when you say Armenia, will define Armenia much more broadly than the internationally recognized borders of the Republic of Armenia. But you have a similar thing in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan always, says that it has this idea of territorial integrity at the top, but as you probably all know, Ilham Aliyev has referred to Armenia itself, to Republic of Armenia itself, historical Azerbaijani lands, basing himself on the presence of Muslim khanates in places like Yerevan and so forth. But if you want to take things further, Azerbaijani nationalism or ethno-nationalism has this, has this extreme territorial claim. If you want to take it really into its greatest extreme, you even have pieces of northern Iraq somehow included in this map. So you have this piece. You have also what Azerbaijani nationalists refer to as southern Azerbaijan, so Iranian Azerbaijan, and then you have something Azerbaijani nationalists refer to as Western Azerbaijan, which is pretty much the Republic of Armenia. And then, of course, the biggest problem of all, Artsakh, and the various claims that Azerbaijanis have on Nagorno-Karabakh based on the complicated histories. And actually, these kinds of conflicts about identity and values are the most difficult to solve because they touch on the very way people define themselves. And that's why the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict has often been referred to as an enduring rivalry by people like Lawrence Breurs. It's a rivalry that, it's one of those rivalries that take decades to resolve, if they're resolved at all. Think about Cyprus, think about India, Pakistan, all that. So it falls within that category. So this is the regional level. Now let's look at the global level. At the global level, and we're talking about the involvement of great powers, how were great powers involved in the past? They were involved mainly through the Minsk group and the co-chairs of the Minsk group, so that's France, Russia, and the United States. The problem with the Minsk group was that it was never it was never defined as a core interest of these great powers. It was always a sideshow. They had some level of investment, but it was never the kind of investment that you see in, for instance, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Not the kind of investment where they would make serious compromises or put serious pressure on the sides to come to an agreement. So that was one thing, relative lack of investment. And of course, the Russian role in the South Caucasus. Russia is, you can't avoid Russia in the South Caucasus, it's still there. There were plenty of people who were saying during the war, in September, October, looking at Russia very late to react, saying, oh, Russia has given up on the South Caucasus, and then they suddenly, on the 9th of November, we hear Putin has negotiated this ceasefire, and Russian troops are coming into Karabakh. But Russia has always been there, And the basic setup for Russia in the South Caucasus is as follows. So it has an alliance with Armenia. It has a formal alliance with Armenia through something called the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Remember that? We'll talk about that in a second. And it also has a friendship treaty dating from 1997 where there is a mutual assistance clause. So it does have a formal alliance with Armenia. Apart from that, it has the 102nd military base in Gyumri, where there are a few thousand military personnel stationed. And of course, not to forget, Russia also guards the border between Armenia, the external borders of Armenia. So the borders between Armenia and Turkey and with Iran. They're staffed by border guards of the FSB. So Armenia also received preferential arms sales. So all the arms that it bought over the past not 2 decades, but several over the past years were at knockdown prices, at preferential prices. And of course, Armenia is also a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, if you remember that, in 2013, 2014, when Armenia was supposed to sign an association agreement with the EU, and Sargsyan was called to Moscow and told, actually, you're going to sign the Eurasian Economic Union, and that's exactly what he did. Now, that does not mean that this alliance is aimed at a specific country. And this alliance is not aimed at Turkey, it's not aimed at Azerbaijan. Why? Well, because Russia describes its relationship with Azerbaijan not as an alliance, but as a strategic partnership. So it has this idea, it does make an effort to maintain relations with Azerbaijan, and it goes vice versa as well. Azerbaijan has been very careful not to upset Russia too much, although they did, I think, push the envelope a bit by inviting mercenaries and Turkish military personnel during the war. They took a calculated risk there. And let's not forget, Russia also sells arms to Azerbaijan at market prices, but Azerbaijan can afford those market prices. So the other thing that you have to keep in mind that, and this is something that I actually argued in the book that I wrote in 2013, is that for Russia, the Karabakh conflict has a pivotal value because it forms part of an effort to divide and rule the Caucasus. It is because of the Karabakh conflict that Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan can't cooperate trilaterally. It's a fundamental break within the region. And I don't believe that it is interested in resolving the Karabakh conflict once and for all, unless that solution somehow solidifies its role in the South Caucasus. We'll discuss that in a second as well. And very importantly also, all these alliances between Armenia and Russia do not apply to Karabakh, to Artsakh. They only apply to Armenian territory, to the territory of the Republic of Armenia. And Russia has been very clear about that in the past as well. So that is one thing that you have to take into account. And that, by the way, Azerbaijan also took into account in September of 2020. The other issue that I talked about at the global level was the general state of international relations, right? What is happening globally in the world? How is the global international system evolving? And up until 2008, and one of the things that changed in the run-up to last year's war was that the liberal international order the liberal principles that used to govern international politics, that was breaking down. And in order to understand that, I want you to think about the way things were from about the 1990s to about 2008. If you go back and you look at how politics functioned, you very much had the dominant West. Its norms were the only norm. You couldn't really be fully authoritarian without taking a risk. So if you were authoritarian, you had to be very careful and keep your head down. Organizations like the European Union, like the Council of Europe, like NATO, had conditionalities. They made cooperation conditional on certain human rights norms, democratic norms, and that all of that controlled authoritarian behavior. So authoritarians, there were authoritarians, but they have to be very careful to ingratiate themselves with the West. And that changed from 2008 onwards, when this system slowly but surely declined. Things like populism, Brexit, Trump, and all that. And Trump is absolutely not interested in keeping up these liberal norms, disciplining authoritarians, and so forth. So there's more to that than that, but you get the idea. The liberal system was declining. And that means that authoritarians had greater autonomy. You could be more authoritarian and get away with it too. It explains, for instance, why you see the emergence of Erdogan in Turkey, much more authoritarian than any other leader since the end of the Cold War. Things like Orban. But to make things worse, over the past decades, authoritarians also were also able to perfect the ways they manipulate those liberal institutions themselves. So they were able to do things like the Azerbaijani laundromat, channeling huge amounts of money to Western politicians. Just recently there was a corruption scandal in Germany, with several MPs caught literally receiving funds from Azerbaijan. And then, of course, you have organizations like Gazprom, Rosneft, Russian state monopolies handing out directorships to various politicians or former politicians, people like Schroeder and so forth, as rewards for being pro-Russian. So authoritarian states have become much more adept at manipulating the West and so forth. So that's the global level. In the run-up to 2020, and it explains to a great deal, and these various explanations look at what happened in September 2020 from various perspectives and from various levels. So what about the situation today? Now, most of you will know the ceasefire agreement signed on the 9th of November. So just to recap, the ceasefire agreement provided for the withdrawal of Armenian forces from around those territories, those territories of the Nagorno-Karabakh region as it existed in the Soviet era, not held by Armenian forces. So that's not held by Armenian forces. That's this dark green here. This had remained, and then here, Agdam. This part had already been captured by the Azerbaijani forces. So this teal, and this is what remains of Karabakh. Russian peacekeepers were introduced, but remember, they only have a 5-year term. After that, essentially Azerbaijan can expel them, if it dares. That's a really important question. It also provided for the unconditional exchange of POWs, which you all know hasn't happened. There's still 200 Armenian POWs in Baku. The opening of transportation links, and the opening of transportation links under Russian supervision. So the links between this part of Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan over.
Can you point it out yourself?
Oh, you can't see. I thought you saw this.
We can't see your cursor.
Okay, so yeah, the transportation links here over the province of Syunik between Azerbaijan proper and Nakhchivan would be under Russian supervision. So you would have more Russian border guards essentially supervising these transportation links. Now, there's a whole issue about whether these are corridors or links, and that's actually a very important issue. But I've looked at the document. I don't see corridors. It says links, not corridors. So, yeah. And then, of course, the most important part, which has been essentially kicked in the long grass, Nagorno-Karabakh status, Artsakh status at the very end. And that's, of course, the most difficult issue of all. So let me go through the various levels again. So what about the regional level? The Karabakh War has certainly exacerbated and illustrated the imbalance of power between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And if the Russians hadn't entered Karabakh, and if there wasn't an alliance between Armenia and Russia, things would have been much, much worse than they are now. Because right now, the Aliyev regime is doing everything to maximize its advantages in the run-up to the negotiations that will no doubt be around the corner after the elections in Armenia. So, and that to some extent explains why you have the situation along the border now. It's using what are called salami tactics to slice off little pieces of Armenia, which is then can bring to the negotiating table once things go up. This is also, for instance, why it keeps 200 POWs in Baku. Again, they're a bargaining chip. It's very cynical. It's pure power politics. And it does so because it knows this is a window of opportunity. There's this huge disparity of power. Let's grab as much as we can. There are other reasons as well. There's also an internal reason, and that explains other issues like the destruction of Armenian monuments, the Albanization of Armenian monuments, things like the Victory Park with these horrible Armenian mannequins. Things like even the use of the word corridor, the constant humiliation of the Armenians, is partly also based on a domestic requirement because, of course, the Aliyev regime is not elected, it does not have democratic legitimacy, and what it has to do is get the maximum out of this victory on the battlefield. Aliyev wants to style himself the great victor of the Second Karabakh War as a way partly of camouflaging his lack of democratic legitimacy. And then, of course, there's the broader issue of Azerbaijani nationalism, which is built on the idea that on the Albanian myth, the Armenians are intruders. Keeping that alive is also part of it. But all of that is, of course, combined with talk about transportation links and how they will benefit everyone in the region, and how they would even be able to benefit Armenia. So in kind of way, the Aliyev regime is talking in two ways, depending on who it is talking to. But certainly towards Armenian society, the emphasis has been on humiliation and really making the most out of highlighting that victory and keeping that memory alive. The question is whether that will continue after the elections or not. In any case, the identity conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we all know that they're as unresolved as ever, in spite of everything. And if anything, they've been reinforced by Turkish involvement, because of course, Turkey is there. Everyone immediately thinks 1915 genocide, and links what happens now with what happened in 1915, which makes it much more difficult for Armenians to deal with that. What about the role of the great powers? Russia has, of course, now become the great arbiter in the conflict. It's the only one with boots on the ground, and it's the only one that will probably have a defining influence on what happens next. And to some extent, what happened was the result of Armenia's, I believe, this is my personal interpretation, over-dependence on Russia over the past 20 years. It's something that you really saw, and on the one hand, if you look at Russia's role in the conflict, on the one hand, yes, it has saved the Armenians of complete annihilation, which was a real possibility if Russia hadn't been there. But and there are several reasons why it intervened. One, of course, was that it didn't want to see its ally humiliated, completely humiliated. That would have been a bit too much. But there are other reasons as well. Remember what I said about Russia not being interested in the Karabakh conflict being completely resolved either way? That also played a part. They intervened so that you would still have Karabakh as an active issue, rather than Karabakh completely ethnically cleansed, and then, I know that sounds extremely cruel, but that's the nature of international politics. So that was one factor that might have influenced their thinking. And of course, the unique opportunity to finally insert troops, boots on the ground, within the South Caucasus and having more broader and more permanent presence within the region. I know that that's somehow, some people say, oh, why would it do that? It's an enormous cost, but that completely dismisses Russia's view of the South Caucasus as its backyard, and the importance that Russia gives to the South Caucasus for its own soft underbelly. Because remember, Russia's own part of the Caucasus, the so-called North Caucasian republics, that's a very, unstable region in itself. And what you've certainly seen is a limited commitment to its alliance with Armenia in recent days. And there are all kinds of ways you can speculate on that, but for instance, in light of the territorial incursions in Armenia, the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is supposed to have a mutual assistance clause between its allies, has been curiously slow and silent in reacting to these incursions. Some people have said, yeah, of course, it's not proven, but then I think, what would NATO do if you had Russian incursions into Baltic territory, or any kind of? It would give the benefit of the doubt to its ally. And the other thing is, of course, that the United States and France have come out with statements that are much clearer in their condemnation of, or in their calls for Azerbaijan to withdraw than Russia itself. So Russia's commitment to its alliance with Armenia has been relatively subdued. You might also link that with the ongoing election, by the way. But I won't speculate more than that. The other thing that has become clear between Armenia and Azerbaijan is the extent to which the equipment that the Armenian armed forces were given, because of their dependence on Russia, they were relying almost exclusively on Russian equipment, was quite outdated and ineffective compared to Azerbaijan's equipment. So all of this are costs that Armenia has paid for its exclusive dependence on Russia. And the most important one, I think, is the fact that Russia's lukewarm intervention in favor of Armenia, I think, can mostly be explained by the fact that it could take Armenia for granted. Armenia had nowhere else to go, and Russia knew that. Whereas Azerbaijan was quite adept at playing off Russia, Turkey. It has options. And in order to understand that, you have to know that Armenia has chosen the Russian path without any kind of what political scientists refer to hedging. Hedging means that you don't put all your eggs in the basket, you just have an exit strategy if something happens, if your ally doesn't quite respond to you. Whereas Azerbaijan had what it called a multi-vectoral strategy. So engaging with different sides. So knowing that, I believe Russia basically said, we can take Armenia for granted. Azerbaijan is ours to lose, so we won't go too much in Armenia. So these are all costs that come with excessive dependence. What about Turkey? Of course, Turkey raised quite a few eyebrows because of its direct involvement and very vocal support for Azerbaijan. Well, why did it do that? Well, the conventional logic is, of course, Azerbaijan and Turkey have a very close ethnic identity. Azerbaijan is probably the closest Turkic ethnic group to the Turks themselves from a linguistic perspective, but there are other drivers as well. You have domestic drivers. Don't forget that Erdogan's popularity has been going down in recent years. The Turkish economy is not in a good shape, so kind of a nationalist diversion might help in counteracting that. Don't forget also that Azerbaijan and Turkey have extensive economic interests, not just Turkey and Azerbaijan, but also Azerbaijan in Turkey. Azerbaijan's elite has built up considerable economic assets in Turkey itself. And there's also the geostrategic and geoeconomic calculation of creating a link between between Turkey and Azerbaijan. So all of that played a role. Now you hear a lot in Armenian analysis in Armenia about pan-Turkism and that kind of idea of all Turks from the Balkans to China coming together and being united. That is actually, I think it's mistaken to see that as a core driver of Turkey. Because don't forget, the AKP, Erdogan's party, is not a pan-Turkish party. It's a pan-Islamist party. It's an Islamist party. The MHP, on the other hand, that's the ultra-nationalists, the Grey Wolves. Yes, they are pan-Turkists, but they're the junior coalition partner. And you should also look at, firstly, the Central Asian states are absolutely not interested in pan-Turkism. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, it doesn't appeal to them at all. Turkey has been very careful in the Uyghur issue, when you would say, well, a real pan-Turkist would go all out in favor of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China. It doesn't do that. So you should see this pan-Turkism that you see, the pan-Turkic discourse that you see, is more of an instrumentalization. They use that in order to mobilize their populations in Azerbaijan and Turkey. Because Azerbaijan's nationalism tends to be statist. It's about the Azerbaijani state. And every now and then they come up with these ideas of two states, one people and all that, but that's rhetoric. Shouldn't put that too much value on that. And then, of course, the systemic level. Remember last September, you still had Trump in power, and Trump is not interested in human rights or democracy or other such liberal stuff. If anything, he likes authoritarians. So the decline of liberal order that I talked about was also very, very, very relevant. And there are still, now you have, of course, Biden in power. You might think that might stop, that this might reverse things, that the liberal order might come back. But really, you have to be very careful with that, because the decline of the liberal order is a secular trend. It's a long-term trend, and one presidency is not going to make the difference. So this is another thing that you have to take into account, looking at the situation today. So liberalism is there to decline, and Armenia and Armenia's policymakers will have to take that into account. So today, Armenia, because of the collapse of many of the assumptions that it had over the past 20 or 30 years, faces multiple questions. And going back to the very complicated nature of security, so it faces questions like how to balance the various sectors of security in view of its defeat in the Second Karabakh War, how to manage relations with neighbors who have now become more problematic because, of course, of the very clear imbalance of power, the very changed balance of power between them. And then, of course, it will have to ask itself questions on what to expect from the great powers from Russia and also from the other powers. And I'll go through these one by one. So regarding the various sectors of security, balancing them out, so military, political, economic, societal, there are various questions that have now popped up and that are very relevant to the election that we're seeing now. And I won't express myself on the election, so I'm very strictly neutral in that. So one of the questions is just how much, what are you going to do now? Is Armenia going to emphasize the military sector even more? Is it going to turn itself into kind of a garrison state where everything is aimed at the military, where it tries to create a military-industrial complex of its own, and so forth? Or does it go more in the direction of a liberal democracy with emphasizing economic growth, democratic freedoms, and so forth? Now, very often in Armenian society nowadays, that's presented as kind of a choice. It's either or. You either have military security or you have liberal democracy. Liberal democracies are weak. They're not able to engage in efficient warfare. Actually, it's not that straightforward. There's plenty of work in the political science literature that says that democracies are actually better at fighting wars than authoritarian states for a number of reasons, because of their improved ability to mobilize populations. They tend to mobilize them more slowly, but they're much better at keeping them engaged and so forth. And don't forget, you have other countries like Switzerland that do have a strong military without turning themselves into garrison states. So, of course, that's a bit far-fetched, but just to say that it's not necessarily contradictory to have an efficient military and a liberal democratic system. The other question that Armenian society has to ask itself is whether it emphasizes geopolitics, so control of territories, whether it emphasizes geoeconomics, so economic growth, transportation links, and so forth. A third question it has to ask is how to define its citizenry. Is it going to continue the idea of pan-Armenianism, so Armenians and people associated with the Republic of Armenia are the residents of the Republic of Armenia and Artsakh itself, and also the diaspora as a whole, or is Armenia just the representative of its citizens? There is an implicit debate in Armenian society going on there between this pan-Armenian idea or the statism, and that of course relates to the place of Artsakh in the global Armenian community, and of course the role of the diaspora in Armenia's future. When it comes to its neighbors, again, Armenia is faced with a number of dilemmas. And there we have to remember that security is interactive and that it takes two to tango. And the real question is whether Azerbaijan will continue in its triumphalism. Of course, if it does so, if it continues humiliating Armenia and trying to press the maximum out of its victory, then any process aimed at normalization or reconciliation is dead in the water. If it doesn't, then you might see the opening of transportation links. Actually, the opening of transportation links will probably happen, partly because Russia has invested itself in it. It's very clearly interested in opening some form of transportation links between Armenia and Azerbaijan that it would then be able to control. So that's pretty much inevitable. The question is what happens then between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. And it is very important there to make a clear distinction between normalization and reconciliation. These are not the same things. So normalization is the opening of embassies, so talking to each other directly, or opening of border posts, which is a possibility. And don't forget, normalization doesn't mean that states necessarily have a good relationship. I mean, India and Pakistan have embassies in their capital, and they're loggerheads the whole time. Turkey and Greece have embassies in their capital. So open borders as well. Again, open borders doesn't mean free trade, just that there is some kind of interaction between the borders. Reconciliation is a completely different topic. And as things stand now, there is no prospect of that happening in the short or even the medium term. The most probable outcome of this is what political scientists refer to as a cold peace, just two sides not shooting at each other. I think that's a very low bar, but that's probably what will happen in the near future, especially since Russia is so engaged in this, wouldn't allow it to get out of hand. Then perhaps you would have an opening of transportation links, but that does not mean that you immediately move to reconciliation. If only because, remember what I said before about conflicts that have to do with identity, with the way people define themselves. These are very weighty issues, and people are very often willing to overrule economic logic. Oh, let's trade, let's make money, because of such identity issues. This is an identity issue. So, reconciliation, I think, that will take, if it ever happens, will take decades. And of course, a lot will depend on what happens on Karabakh status. And there you have to be, it's very difficult to acknowledge that, but you have to acknowledge that Artsakh is now a Russian, not an Armenian protectorate. It used to be under Armenian protection up to November 2020. Now, the Russians are the ones protecting Artsakh, which is, of course, it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, the Russians would be able to protect Artsakh if necessary, but if they see it in their interest to come or to press Armenia into a certain direction when it comes to Karabakh status, there's very little Armenia will be able to do to resist that. Effectively, a lot is in Russia's hand. And there are all kinds of ways in which you can imagine Russia giving up on Artsakh. If it, for instance, has these transportation links and that it controls and that solidify its influence over the South Caucasus, then you could see them pressuring the Karabakh Armenians into some kind of arrangement. Not to forget, until that's the case, it's in their interest to keep the issue open. So, and that's of course the great question for Armenia: what to expect from the great powers, from Russia specifically. And one of the great questions now is, of course, how will relations between Armenia and Russia evolve? Does Armenia go for greater integration with or dependence on Russia? But at this point, Armenia is so dependent on Russia that would come at the cost of Armenian sovereignty and statehood. It's a dilemma that people in Armenia will have to decide on in the next election. As I said, Russia is unlikely to unequivocally take Armenia's side in all of this, unless Azerbaijan miscalculates in a major way. Remember, it does have an interest in keeping Azerbaijan on board. It has peacekeepers there. It doesn't want to expose them to unnecessary risk. And of course, it can take Armenia for granted, at least for now. And as I said, it's not interested in a final solution to Nagorno-Karabakh unless it solidifies its place in the South Caucasus. And these are structural realities. Any government that comes to power will be faced with this reality of Armenia's dependence on Russia, and the choice to be made between, do we go for more dependence, or do we and give up some of our sovereignty or statehood, or do we somehow adopt a more balanced approach? So in conclusion, Armenian society faces very difficult dilemmas on the eve of the elections, and it's not very surprising now that that the election is very hard fought, and it has apparently become very close in recent weeks, because these are very difficult times. People are off balance, and they have to make very difficult decisions on the future of their country. And many of the questions that are being asked, by the way, are not right or wrong questions. They're value questions. They're about how Armenia defines itself and how Armenia defines its own reality. But for a small state like Armenia, and that's the only kind of advice that I would give, it is important to maintain a clear view of the requirements of security and the limits of its power. And I'll conclude with this guy here, Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli, not in the sense that Armenia should become this ruthless state that does anything it takes to, that goes into all kinds of immoral or amoral directions in order to achieve things. No. Niccolo Machiavelli had other points to make. And one of the most important points he made was involved a fox and a lion. It's one of my favorite parts of The Prince. So he says that a good prince acts as a fox when he's weak and as a lion when he's strong. So you have to be very, very aware of the power you have and define your interests accordingly. The other idea that Machiavelli has is the idea of virtu. And it's not virtue. It's not virtue in the English sense. So, being a faithful husband and all that. It's about being a good citizen of a state. And that's one of the insights that I think is lacking among Armenians. Armenians are an old ethnic group, so they have a very long history, but they're a very young state. And Armenians have a lack of state-centric thinking. It's very difficult to do that. Armenians were stateless for such a long time. Their nationalism emerged under statelessness. And one of the things that it hasn't done is move towards a state-focused nationalism. The idea that the state is the primary, and its survival is the primary area of concern. And that is difficult because it will also require not engaging in all kinds of moral crusades and being realistic about the possibilities of Armenia. And I'll end with a slightly controversial, perhaps, note, but for instance, commemorating the Sèvres Treaty. I think that was counterproductive and pointless because the Sèvres Treaty is not something that Armenia can achieve anytime soon and will probably not be able to achieve. And I'll make the point, doesn't have validity under international law. And to me, it was also puzzling why Armenians would commemorate a treaty, the Sèvres Treaty, that promised them much, but that was abrogated, that was overruled 3 years later in the Lausanne Treaty. If anything, the Sèvres Treaty is an insult. It's this kind of thinking that Armenia should let go of many of the illusions that it has and should be able to, also very important, not rely on the kindness of strangers when it comes to its politics and its external politics. One of the things that really upset me about things during the war were the appeals to Western powers and Western media. Why aren't you speaking out? By the time you're appealing to these Western powers in statecraft, it's already too late. The war has already started, and there's very little the outside world can do or will be able to do because whether or not people intervene depends on their national interest. So this kind of, I'm talking about Armenian political culture in general, thinking, not counting on the kindness of strangers, but being aware that strangers will intervene only if it's in their national interest to do so. This awareness of your own interests and of the interests of others, I think that is something that Armenians still have to get a grasp on. And with that, of course, a healthy skepticism of the promises from all great powers. I think great powers do what they do because of their national interest, not because of compassion or humanitarian. Sometimes they will act in a humanitarian way, but when it's not too costly, when it doesn't counteract their national interest. But yeah, a healthy skepticism towards Russia, for instance. There are too many Armenians, in my view, that idealize Russia. They say, oh, if we just align with Russia, everything will be okay. Russia, our brother, and so forth. It doesn't work that way. And I'll conclude here.
So where do we go from here? A million questions to be answered. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for making us think. And I'm even reluctant to ask the audience to actually ask questions in fear how long this can take. But because I myself have about 10 questions. But no, but seriously, the only thing I will say is that this kind of talk and this kind of issues should be a regular event, where these kind of things should have been taking place, debated for the last 30 years, so that we could have actually had some maybe influence to what's actually happened now. And that's a very sad indictment of our Armenian society in diaspora, that the debates and the discussions really haven't really genuinely taken place in a critical form. There's no Armenian forums where people, communities can get together and actually discuss things. They're more interested about commemorating the past, be it religious, be it, April 24th, those are all valid. I'm not dismissing them. I'm just saying the contemporary reality of Armenia, Armenians, political, social, economic, whatever, has just been doesn't exist, unfortunately. It hasn't existed. There's a great thirst for it now, and it must come soon. Otherwise, we're not going to move forward. Sorry.
Can I say something on that? Actually, I have a very clear view of the relationship between diaspora and Armenia. I think there should be a separation between being culturally Armenian and being politically Armenian. So there's the Armenians as a cultural entity, and that includes all Armenians throughout the world. So you have the homeland, Artsakh, Javakh, and the diaspora. That's the cultural Armenia. That's cultural Armenia. But then you have political Armenia, and that's the citizens in Armenia and in Artsakh, the people who pay their taxes, and it will be most directly affected by political decisions they make on their own polities. I think that's very important. Diaspora can play a role, but it has to be a supporting role. It can't really decide for Armenia and Artsakh what should happen. That's my view. And I've been very strong about that because, for instance, one of the things that I haven't done is apply for Armenian citizenship, because I am not an Armenian citizen. If I want to apply, you go back, you live there, you apply.
But to put that in practice, what should be taking place or should have been taking place has been a much more critical perspective position by Armenians from abroad. In the sense that there's this blind worship, not necessarily of Armenia, the state, but rather the successive governments. So I can give you so many examples. Just completely blind worship of one corrupt government after another, one corrupt official after another who came into this country or visited, and the list goes on. We should be much more critical of how the Armenian government behaves, because there is actually not just a political fallout in terms of what's happening now with Karabakh and the state, but also the immigration. And as a center which actually deals with Armenian refugees, I can tell you that for the last 20 years, refugees do come, not in great numbers, but they come to UK, they go to America, they go to France, so we feel what's going on, and not just in terms of refugees, but the dependency of Armenians and the failure of the state, because we get calls for charitable donations by individuals, people want to study scholarship, which they should be studying. There's not two ways about it, but I'm just saying the continual demand for financial support by Armenians. It's the perspective, the perception that people have on both sides, both in Armenia and abroad, are completely out of sync. There's no other way I can put that. There's a lot to repair. There's a lot to discuss and clarify. Sorry. And all your questions, all your comments, especially Kevork's patience in dealing with it. As Hasmik said, this shouldn't be the end. This should be the start. And these two should take place regularly, because only through regular debate Like, can we become even clearer, improve our communications, have a clear understanding of the realities that we face, both in Armenia and abroad. And so, yeah, let's continue to meet as and when we can. And thank you once again. Please, even though Kevork is going to go back to Birmingham, please, I'm sure he'll be here to speak to you one-to-one, as you so wish. Thank you again.
No problem.